wanted to ask the question, two questions. Is it actually the right thing to say advantages and disadvantages? And spoiler alert, I don't think it is. I think it should actually say benefits and detriments. And the second thing is, what do we actually mean by data protection law enforcement? Do we just mean it's the ability to hammer people with fines? And certainly inquiries and investigations, decisions and administrative fines are extremely important. But I think it's more than that. I think it consists of any regulatory activities and intervention which drives a culture of compliance and disincentivises non-compliance. So by all means it might be the fines, but there must be other regulatory interventions as well, and that could be consultation, amicable resolutions and other drivers of changes in controller and processor behaviour. It includes court enforcement of data protection rights, and so it's very important in any country that there's access of data subjects and representative bodies to courts to uphold and enforce data protection rights. It might also, in the wider sense, be simply an environment where there's a culture of compliance. And I wouldn't underestimate that, because it might be surprising to hear, but it was something I was thinking about over the past while, and particularly over the last 2 years of a pandemic. I realised that Ireland's actually a very compliant place. A lot of other places where there was riots going on with lockdowns, and Ireland must have been one of the most locked down places at one stage in Europe, and yet there were very few riots. There were very few complaints other than the odd completely bonkers person who thought, wearing a tinfoil hat, that this was all nonsense. So there was a culture of compliance. You go back another 13 years to 2009, huge recession that lasted for about 6 years, and yet in the main we took our medicine, tax rates went up about 10% to try to resolve things, and yet there still wasn't that sort of, riots, etc. So there is a technical culture of compliance in the jurisdiction, notwithstanding, the whole fighting Irish, belligerent Irish, drunk Irish type mentality that we all like to propagate. In addition to that, we look at public interest enforcement and we look at private enforcement. So public interest enforcement is obviously by the regulator itself, but private enforcement is by data subjects or the representative bodies. So what I'm really saying here is I think data protection law enforcement is a very wide thing, and we need to look at all of the different strands. And so if the focus is on compliance rather than enforcement, maybe it's not the correct terminology. I tend to get approached by clients who come up to me and say, how do we best comply with something? They don't come up to me and say, I really want to get away with all of this. How can you help me avoid any sanction? Like, it's not a sort of a, for those of you who know this programme, it's not a sort of a Scooby-Doo type scenario where if it wasn't for those pesky kids, I would have got away with it. It's actually designed, people want to actually comply. And so instead of advantages and disadvantages, I think we should look at it as benefits and challenges. So let's look at some perceived advantages or perceived benefits, now that I've contradicted myself immediately, having said it should be benefits and detriments. The first thing is, maybe this might surprise some people, the general view amongst those canvassed was that data protection enforcement is not the main reason for establishing your main headquarters in Ireland. There's a lot of other factors that are taken on board. First and foremost, there's a long history of foreign direct investment in the state. You can look at that list of tech companies, all of which have been established a long time. It goes back to Microsoft in 1985, to Meta in 2008. But the key thing about those dates is it's way before GDPR. In fact, with some of them, it's actually way before our Data Protection Act 1988, certainly way before the directive as well. All of those companies established long before GDPR. Another reason might be that there's cultural similarities with the US and the UK, leading to a number of US new companies actually wanting to establish in Ireland. So the statistic is there's 31.5 million US residents who claim Irish ancestry. Don't know how many times I've been in the States when they go, hey man, I'm Irish too. And you're going, okay, don't sound that Irish, but I'll take your word for it. And then in the UK, there's up to 6 million people. And by UK, I mean mainland Britain, obviously not Northern Ireland, with at least one Irish grandparent. So that means that there could be 6 million people in Britain who have the right to an Irish passport. Put that in context, there's only 5 million people in the Republic of Ireland, so there's more people entitled to passports over here than there are back in the Republic of Ireland. But I mention that because cultural similarities can very often be a driver, and so in a post-Brexit environment, The UK might feel a bit more comfortable establishing in Ireland, and the US, that's been on a longer term basis. Other advantages: highly skilled multinational workforce, open economy, clarity of corporation tax rate, although that itself has been a bit controversial too. Employment and other grants to incentivise employment. This one I had to laugh about. There was a couple of people who actually said good climate, like it's cold and wet, but apparently that's great for data centres. Not great for anything else, but it's great for data centres. And I believe Scotland has a similar competitive advantage as well. Political stability. It's been 100 years since the establishment of the state, and notwithstanding a civil war at the very start, there's been nothing since. Objective and fair court system and judiciary, which is internationally respected, and the ability to hear data protection disputes in the commercial court, which can speed up proceedings despite a lot of the publicity otherwise. Other perceived advantages that people commented on was that the DPC was regarded as a pragmatic and reasonable and solution-focused regulator, that they were open to consultation on data protection issues, that they're open to meetings with practitioners. So, for example, there are regular meetings with the IP and Data Protection Committee of the Irish Law Society, which helps to canvass views and explain difficulties that are being faced by clients. There's also a perception of being dealt with fairly, although the people who mentioned that made a point of saying that there's no difference in perception between that and other authorities around Europe. So there was a general perception of being dealt with fairly in other European countries as well. There was also a perception that the DPC was understanding of efforts being made to comply with data protection law and sympathetic to the challenges that are faced by, it's not always possible to be 100% compliant. There was also a perception that notwithstanding recent regulatory action and fines, the DPC is still more focused on other forms of regulatory intervention to foster compliance, and that was regarded as a good thing. Another good thing was increased staff numbers, and that made it easier to consult with them. An increased level of published guidance and decisions were welcomed, and the publication of the regulatory strategy was perceived as giving controllers and processors more clarity on DPC focus and objectives. And I think that'll be even better when it's, across Europe is very similar as well.